Everybody's outraged now at the idea that the United States government has got possession of these craft and have recovered the bodies of these beings, and they know that they're non-human, and they're still not telling us about it. They somehow think it's a national security secret that there's an entire non-human civilization surrounding us in our own galaxy. You know, I mean, they're treating us like pygmies on a little island in Fiji in the 1950s that think they're the entire universe, you know, and they didn't even realize there was a whole world outside there. And that's how they're trying to treat us. And that's insulting, you know, and you don't want to have a representative who treats you like that, period.
Most people who end up in the UFO space arrive there through wonder. Today's guest arrived there through evidence. Danny Sheehan is a Harvard-trained constitutional lawyer who spent 50 years inside the room where American power actually operates. The Pentagon Papers, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Wounded Knee. He has represented whistleblowers, nuclear workers, indigenous tribes, and some of the most credible UFO witnesses on the whole planet. Danny Sheehan doesn't believe the cover-up exists because he read about it online. He believes it exists because he spent half a century watching how it works from the inside the systems of power. Danny, welcome to the show.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate being here.
So before we get into UFOs, I really want the audience to understand who you are. And your career is one of the most unusual in probably American legal history, right? You spent 50 years taking on the most powerful institutions in the world on behalf of people who those institutions want to silence. What's the thing that kind of connects all of it for you?
Well, I guess it really started because of my being a co-founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review back in 1968, that big kind of halcyon year when everything was going wild in the United States. You know, there was the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April, the assassination of Robert Kennedy in June, the big riots that went on at the National Convention for the Democratic Party in Chicago, and then ultimately the election of Richard Nixon, you know, which began that entire Nixon era. And we had that led to the Watergate burglary, had the church committee hearings going on about all the violations of law by the CIA. Well, it turns out I happen to have been involved in all those things. Because I'd come off the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review, and we had initiated the case there at the Law Review that ended up establishing the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. So we ended up developing a lot of really great sources who were talking to journalists or willing to talk to journalists as long as they could be protected. And so that's how I got started. And so I got to meet lots of different whistleblowers and lots of different journalists. And we ended up doing the Karen Silkwood case. Eventually. But importantly, I was at Jesuit headquarters, where I was in the office in charge of policy for the Jesuit order here in the United States. And because of that, we had Jesuits in 42 different countries providing information to us. You know, I'd been legal counsel in F. Lee Bailey's office during the Watergate burglary. So we had a whole group of 40 private licensed gun carrier professional investigators. And I learned to work with them, and I had access to them over the years. So we started putting together these kind of resources and ended up establishing an institute to actually be able to do what it is that you would think that you ought to do if you were a real justice lawyer. And not getting trapped inside the Justice Department, which is ultimately politicized, the whole thing. Not working for a district attorney's office, which is also politically, corrupted, and so we set up an institute, the Cristic Institute originally, that was available to regular citizens. And what we were trying to do is to make certain that the Constitution of the United States was abided by. And of course, we discovered that it was being ignored substantially by the members of the national security state. And never dared to be really enforced by members of Congress. So we ended up getting the job of trying to enforce the Constitution. We had alliances with American Civil Liberties Union, NAACP, the B'nai B'rith. We had alliances with all the people, the Southern Poverty Law Center. But we were a kind of a unique institute that got set up to actually not only search out cases and raise the funds to prosecute those cases, but to never agree to settle. Not just to trade it in for some money being given to a particular plaintiff, that we were going to carry it all the way to the end. And we were going to get trials and we were going to get judgments against these people and enforceable court orders. That's the unique aspect to our entire operation. Of course, that led to the Iran-Contra case where George Bush ordered the Internal Revenue Service to revoke our 501c3 tax-exempt charter, saying that because he was running for re-election and we were revealing his direct involvement in the Iran-Contra criminal acts, that he said that we were engaged in political activity against him. And as the sitting president, he ordered his politically appointed head of the Internal Revenue Service to revoke our 501c3 tax-exempt charter. And that earned us a great deal of celebrity. Because we're the only one that had ever been done to, but we ended up being offered the position to be the head of the Romero Institute, out in California, and so we just rolled over and started performing all of the same activities on behalf of the Romero Institute, which is what we have now. So that's how I kind of uniquely got into this particular unique practice. You could call it kind of a boutique practice, if you will, representing citizens against the national security state. But all the time that I was doing those kind of major high profile cases, I was working on the issue of UFOs, because it became perfectly clear to me that ultimately, if you wanted to look at the overarching ultimate strategic conspiracy, that's what's going on, is that the national security state people had recovered one or more non-human extraterrestrial spacecraft, and they knew that the occupants were non-human extraterrestrial beings, and they were concealing all of this from the American public and the world in order to try to develop the technology into a weapons system where they could establish full spectrum military dominance over the planet, so as to maintain their continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that they deem necessary to be supplied to our American corporations. And we found the documents that said that's exactly how they viewed their mission, And so, once we belled the cat, we knew exactly what we were dealing with. And so that then we got contacted by different people at different times, including eventually Lou Elizondo, who was the head of he was the chief of security for the program inside the Pentagon. And he reached out to us to ask us to represent him in bringing a complaint with the Inspector General to bring to the attention of the American public the fact that this secret existed and that we could facilitate the whistleblowers to get them in front of Congress and to put pressure on Congress to actually call them in public hearings. So that's how we got to be in this position. People keep asking us, how in the world did you ever end up right in the middle of every single one of the issues? And the reason is because there wasn't really any competition. Anybody else who wanted to do that, especially after we suffered having our first 501c3 revoked at the direct order of President Bush. That we were right toe to toe with them, but we figured out a way to keep on going. And to this date, we've succeeded over a period of about 50 years to do this.
Did going into UFOs feel like a left turn for you, or was it kind of an obvious progression to that deeper conspiracy within the system?
I had always, well, as I mentioned, while I was doing all of these other things that were much more public, I was in fact working away at investigating, since I had these investigative resources, investigating the UFO issue, because I was convinced that it was true. That I'd seen the Betty and Barney Hill thing. I'd read all the books and everything about it. And I said, this is clearly true. And so I'm going to turn my attention to this and try to develop some of the resources to do the investigation. And that's why I ended up being contacted. I got contacted initially, as you probably know, by President Carter's people, to help participate in the investigation of his knowledge of the existence of UFOs. And then I got contacted by Dr. Stephen Greer, I got contacted by Dr. John Mack at Harvard to represent him. So in each one of these cases, I got more and more additional information about what it is that we were doing. And so it deepened one step at a time the degree of conviction I had that these things were true. And when Lou Elizondo contacted me, I was fully prepared to go before the Inspector General of the Defense Department and help lay out the information that convinced him that this was true. And once we got him convinced that this was true, we also had one of the whistleblowers, Dave Grush, go to the Inspector General for the intelligence community and convince him, Chuck McCullough. And Chuck McCullough not only concluded that what Grush was telling him was true, but he actually retired and became David Grush's attorney to represent him, so that we've been building these kind of coalition of people to participate in getting this disclosure done. And at the same time now, of course, in our New Paradigm Institute, we're trying to figure out how we have to get out ahead of the game to start proposing amendments to our particular institutions here on our planet to absorb this information once we start getting it. And that's kind of a unique contribution that we're making here, in addition to trying to get the disclosure itself and to protect the whistleblowers and to facilitate getting the Congress to do the right thing by actually drafting legislation for them, which we have done. We drafted the 15-page enhanced UFO whistleblower protection statute, and we've also drafted the 58-page bill to have Congress take over disclosing this. To declassify the information themselves and to reveal it to the people. So we're doing all of these different things, and we're engaged in the major grassroots organizing of the citizenry around the country to get people involved directly as citizens in demanding this information and educating the people who are all going, holy mackerel, you mean this is really true? I mean, a substantial plurality of people suspected that it was true. A lot of people, a smaller number, believed that it was true, but the fact of the matter is we started putting them into possession of information that made it clear that they knew it was true now. And that's where we are now.
Yeah, we've kind of moved from that I want to believe to I want to know, and
Yes.
to I know. We've had all of these
That's right.
amazing congressional hearings and things like that with people producing, the goods really that everyone's wanted to see. Do you think that I always like to zoom in on that word disclosure because it kind of means different things to us all. I've seen some people that say everything that Lou Elizondo revealed under oath in front of Congress, to them, that's disclosure. What does disclosure mean to you? Well,
full disclosure would require, as we put into the statute, that every single piece of information that has ever come into the hands of any government official or any government agent or operative, whether formal or informal, so that it's in the possession of the United States government, has to be publicly revealed. And what we're trying to do is figure out what the choreographing of that ought to be best done. How you don't want to just drop the whole thing on everybody all at one time. Like, here's 10 million pages of stuff and nobody's going to read it. It's like having 50 phone books dropped on your head. Yeah. What we want to do is we want to release this information to people as we prepare our institutions to respond to it, so that we can integrate the information and come out with this being an ultimately constructive process. That's what we're engaged in. And now one of the areas that the people that are in the legacy program, the UFO legacy program, is they don't want their own personal criminality displayed. But the fact of the matter is, in order to motivate people to do anything about this, because people might say, well, what difference does it make to me? But people get upset at people, basically kidnapping young kids who are psychic and bringing them to these big farms and then doping them up with amphetamines to try to jack them up into a state of hyper consciousness, and then frying some of their brains out. These are things that are going to cause regular people who in their everyday life don't pay attention to reality itself. to pay attention to this. And so what we have to do is have a full revelation of everything that's been done. Okay, and there's a demand on the part of the people inside the legacy group to get amnesty for everything that they've done. They want a full amnesty program. They're always into those things. Abu Ghraib. We finally revealed that they were torturing people, to death. In fact, and not a single person. The one female corporal who happened to have had the indiscretion of having her picture taken holding one of the hostages on a dog leash, she ended up getting disciplined, but, everybody else walked away, and in fact, the woman who was overseeing the security at the Abu Ghraib facility ended up being rewarded by being made the head of the CIA. And so what causes a lot of young people to say, why should I care? Why should I get involved in all this? That's all so corrupt. They're also venal that I don't want to embarrass myself by, pretending I believe it. So our job is to help get people reconvinced that it's true and that we can do something about it. But our job is to facilitate doing something about it, so that the people who are willing to take the time and effort get the demonstration that in fact it can be successful. So that's what we're doing. So now the amount of things, I could spend time going down the list of what the particulars are that are going to get revealed by disclosure. Like I hinted here at the children thing. But the fact that we know that the ET people they navigate their craft telepathically, and that there's this technology that actually exists. It's an interface between consciousness and technology that they have mastered, which actually enables them to move from. They navigate inside our atmosphere with telepathic communication with their ship, but the fact is they transport from their distant star system by location. It's a whole other thing that has usually been reserved for saints, in prophets that are allegedly able to bilocate. But there's all kinds of criteria that have been historically confined to prophets and saints and stuff, which are capacities of our human family that have been concealed from us. So there has to be disclosure not only on the part of the national security state of our United States government, and other governments, by the way, but also by the Catholic Church, that has been around for 2026 years, and that they've got lots of information about this, and they need to reveal this too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, and we could go so many directions from that, but there's something that you're kind of, I think, getting at here. And it's really interesting that you worked in, the Jesuit priesthood, the traditions there with those, because I wonder if that shaped about how you think about this. Do you see this as a spiritual question as much as a legal one?
Sure, I do. Absolutely. That one of the reasons that I agreed to work with the Jesuits is because I thought they had this kind of much, much more expansive scope of consciousness, which is it moves on into the spiritual. I mean, if you really are going to try to deal with the different aspects, the reality is sort of a set of concentric circles. People that live in their own little day-to-day life, that's is the tiniest concentric circle about their reality, their family and their job and, what they watch on television and what limited news that they get on television, and then there's another circle of people who actually are fortunate enough to go to college and get a much more expansive view of history and a more expansive view of what's going on in the world. They learn about economics and they learn about history and political science, et cetera, and then there are people who there's another concentric circle of people who actually go into the government and start discovering that there are other dimensions of information that have been withheld. Then there are people in the intelligence community that actually know more than even the elected representatives. And then the Jesuits tend to cross over a lot of that because they're basically the diplomatic corps for the Vatican and for the Catholic Church. and they're the scholars, they run the universities, and so they're extraordinarily well educated. They're experienced in foreign policy and diplomacy, and so I said, this is a good client to have, to go there. I went from being one of the lawyers at the #1 corporate law firm, litigation law firm in the world at Cahill Gordon, right out of Harvard Law School. And then I went to the #1 criminal defense firm in the country with F. Lee Bailey. And then I said, that's not working. These people are all part of the problem, part of the system. I've got to go somewhere where there's people that have a more expansive view of reality. And it turned out that was the Jesuit headquarters in Washington. So I was there. I'd been there for like 3 years as their general counsel in their social ministry office. My father, David, said to me, Danny, haven't you noticed that you're the only guy in the entire staff that's not a Jesuit? And I said, sure, that's obvious. He said, well, look, haven't you ever thought about being a Jesuit? I said, I haven't ever thought about being a Jesuit. He said, well, you should really think about it, because it's going to give you a whole base of operation from which to do the stuff you're doing in social ministry and all that. And so I ended up saying, well, there's a few, conditions here, on my being willing to do this. And I don't understand whatever it is about being a Jesuit priest or a priest in general, that somehow the women are supposed to be disqualified for. I don't know what it is. So I'm not understanding something here. And so I want you to explain to me what it is about, male genitalia, and in that particular hormone system that makes you capable of whatever it is that's required to be a priest, but women can't be that.
I love that you asked that.
And I also said, that I'm perfectly aware of meditation. I meditate, an hour in the morning, an hour at night. I did that before I was even here at Jesuit headquarters. So I know the dynamic by means of which meditation leads you to higher states of consciousness. So you end up kind of giving up eating meat because it starts to really offend you. The whole idea, of slaughtering some poor living animal and eating their leg or something,
Yeah.
And I also understand how it can get you to transcend this kind of, sport fucking, where you end up, going to bed with anybody who wants to go to bed with you, and I can understand how you kind of outgrow that, and you don't do that anymore. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a genuine love relationship with another person, and be partners with them and have children and do all the other stuff. So I don't get that one either. So that if the Jesuit order was formed, back in 1547 to reform the Catholic Church, at that point, because of all of the violations of decency that the Catholic Church was engaged in at the time, I said, if your job is to reform the Catholic Church, you gotta come to grips with this one, or you're going to run out of Jesuits. My generation of guys aren't going to go for this. You're not going to have Jesuit priests. And so so they said, well, we'll keep talking about that. So I became a candidate for the Jesuit priesthood and was there for a full 10 years. And then we spun off the Cristic Institute from there, so that we could represent not only the Jesuit order, but all 54 of the major religious denominations in the country in their social ministry offices to do major cases for. And that's how but I've always viewed what they characterize as, quote, spiritual, as having to do with consciousness, having to do with higher consciousness. So that I think this entire issue has to do with consciousness and the levels of consciousness that our human family is evolving toward. And Teilhard de Chardin writes about this at some length, who happens to be a Jesuit priest and was a paleontologist, the man who discovered Peking man. And he was basically suggesting that Christ and others like the Buddha and Lao Tzu and some of these others were evolutionary manifestations of where our human family is moving toward, kind of teleologically and progressively, that these people were like mutations of where we were going. And so he was prohibited from writing or talking about that by the Catholic Church because they thought that was going to blow their deal. that they had interposed themselves between the individual and the infinite and eternal consciousness, and so that they'd be out of business if everybody got to do this themselves. So the bottom line, but Teilhard has written about it a lot. He's now studied in great depth by all the Jesuit novices, and they're in the process of trying to move toward this thing of evolving the Catholic Church to come to grips with this issue of consciousness that has been portrayed as, quote, spiritual. And now they're going to have to confront the reality of the intervention on the part of extraterrestrial beings who have showed up on our planet, who have visited people, who have shared information with people, that have played some role in at least the technological and cultural evolution of our human family, if not the biological evolution of our family, and that's still subject to investigation. But the Catholic Church has to get with it. The Catholic Church, is the largest single religious denomination in all of Western civilization, and if we can get them to move to the true message that Christ was actually communicating to people about who he was and what he represented, and that our human family would do greater things than he, in the future. He talked about this all the time, and so that I view everything through this prism of consciousness, so that the UFO issue is doing this a little bit more forthrightly, because they navigate their ships with consciousness, and they communicate with people telepathically, and that they move their ships by bilocation, these things that are all functions of consciousness. So that they're going to have to come to grips with this thing now. And I'm hoping that under Leo, he's going to see that, by being trapped in the scientific, logical, positivist, strictly materialist worldview, it leads to the kind of conditions we have right now. The preposterous condition we find ourselves in, with having divided ourselves into separate little physical territories in the world, and probed into the center of the material reality to probe into the center of atoms, and have just chosen to make a weapon out of it, to try to vanquish each other, and to the point of potentially threatening to destroy the entire human domain, So somebody ought to understand that this one's not working, all by itself. So,
right.
Yeah, I do see this as a spiritual issue.
What a journey you've been on, Danny, from everything you said, the Carter administration, looking at those Blue Book files, going into the Vatican archives. I'm really curious as you've kind of gone along this journey, what did you believe early on that you kind of had to let go of?
I guess one of the things I had to let go of is that it turns out that the national security state people have in fact developed some of this technology much farther than I thought they had. And that if I were, for example, out walking in a field tomorrow night and a big triangular UFO came over, instead of my going, wow, there's a whole extraterrestrial civilization here, I ought to say, hey guys, what can we do together? I would say, this may be our guys. This may be our guys flying these things around. Stephen Greer and I went back and forth about this over a 20-year period. And Stephen was always trying to convince me that they had made much more progress in back engineering some of this technology than I had thought they had. So I had to let go of that and acknowledge that, that Stephen was right on that. But I haven't acknowledged his conviction that they're planning to stage a fake UFO invasion. But I know that they're perfectly capable of doing something like that, but the fact that they're perfectly capable of it doesn't mean they're actually planning to do it. And Stephen has gone to the point of trying to warn people, he's sort of the Paul Revere of the UFO movement, trying to warn them that the fake, the false flag is coming, and that we need to be prepared against it. So I haven't gone that far yet, but I have had to give up my initial belief that they'd been unsuccessful in trying to back engineer some of this because they had been so unsuccessful for so long. because they couldn't figure out the consciousness thing. They couldn't figure out how to make the craft go. Because their pilots that they would assign the job of flying these things were trained in exactly the opposite direction. I mean, they were completely left-brained, rational mathematicians that ran computers and stuff on these jets, and that their entire mindset, if you will, was antithetical to learning how to do that. And so what they did is they started going and finding young children that were displaying psychic abilities and trying to train them and bring them up through a whole education system, a secret education system, to train them to be pilots of the craft. And they've obviously got some of them now that have been brought all the way up through this process where they're now, 18 to 20 years old, and that they know how to fly these things. And so I was surprised by that. Okay. Now, I've also had to, face the issue that it is possible that out of the at least half a dozen different species that there are, it is in fact possible that one of them, at least, or possibly more, may be so indifferent to the general welfare of our human family that they are not going to be the kind of compassionate partner that we would want to have as we become, members of this kind of galactic civilization. And I need to find out more through our whole investigative and research processes here at the Institute, what the dynamics are among them, among the different races or species here, because we need to know that in order to be able to establish, geopolitical relations with the more positive and benign of the beings. So that's something that I've had to kind of come to grips with. I was always very much of the opinion that they were going to be this completely uniform, absolutely positive, upward, positive, forward, kind of angelic kind of beings. And my sense is there may be a little bit of trouble in paradise here that we have to deal with.
And I guess it's kind of like us, right? Like you can go out in the world and you can meet some amazing humans in the day, and then you go out on another day and one of them is going to stab you, and they won't even look at you like you're a full, multifaceted human,
Yeah. So those have been a couple of the things that I have to deal with, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah. Interesting. So a lot of the people you've worked with, I find it really interesting because, Lou Elizondo and Stephen Greer, I find Stephen Greer is always saying, don't listen to Lou. And then you listen to someone else and they're saying, don't listen to this person, but they're all your clients and they sometimes kind of contradict and infight amongst themselves. So I'm really curious how you as a lawyer that's representing these people kind of hold all of those truths at the same time without getting involved in that, he said, she said, don't listen to them,
No, I only represent people with whom I agree. I mean, that I don't just take clients that come in off the street and say, here, I shot my cousin, and so here, defend me, or I've been falsely accused of robbing a bank, and so I need to defend. We don't do those kind of cases. That we take cases or even create cases that are going to address a major public policy problem that we can bring to a litigation footing and get a jury to make a decision, like in the Karen Silkwood case, to stop the construction of all private nuclear power plants in the United States because it was demonstrated that they were absolutely reckless and careless and that they should not be insured. Nobody wanted to insure them anymore once we displayed how they really were conducting themselves. But when people contact me, Stephen Greer contacted me and asked me to become legal counsel for the disclosure program because he knew that I'd been in that field and been working for years with Dr. John Mack at his project on extraordinary experience research in Cambridge, and knew all kinds of contactees and all kinds of researchers, et cetera. And so when Lou Elizondo contacted me, I was still legal counsel for the Disclosure Project. Okay, now he knew that, even though he knew he didn't agree with Stephen Greer on a whole lot of things, and so I when he asked me to legally represent him, he and I sat down and had a few long conversations about, let's get really clear that, I'm not going to compromise what I believe, to just represent you on what you believe, because I think that you're overemphasizing the potential threat to our national security by these ET people. And so he and I had a very clear and candid set of conversations, and he still wanted to retain me. So I went back and talked with Stephen about it, and told Stephen that I'd been asked to represent Lou, and I'd worked out a thing where I thought that we understood each other well enough that I could do that. And Stephen was quite concerned about that right at the time, because he had a very firm belief that Lou Elizondo was part of basically an illegal covert operation, that he was engaged in trying to drag the UFO community into supporting his thesis that the UFOs were basically a national security threat. And Stephen was concerned that he thought that these might be incompatible. I told him I thought they were not. And so that we said that, look, let's try this and see how this goes. But then the two of them sort of started kind of going at it.
Oh, yeah.
Publicly, and it got more and more difficult. And then so Stephen said to me that I had to make a choice, that I was going to have to stop representing Lou and all these other people, dealing with, David Grush and all the other folks that were revealing information. And I had to stop doing that and just basically exclusively represent Stephen. And that I had to basically take a position that I agreed with everything Stephen was saying. And I said, we've been getting along perfectly well for 20 years without me agreeing with everything that you say. But then he finally, that all I know is that some person indicating that they were somehow a legal counsel for him ended up sending me a note saying that I had to stop referring to myself as the current legal counsel for the Disclosure Project. I could refer to myself as the former 20-year legal counsel to the Disclosure Project. And I said, well, I haven't received any communication directly from Stephen on that. And so, fuck you. I don't, I don't know who you are, And so the bottom line is, but I then realized that it may well have been coming from Stephen. And so I have referred to myself consistently as the 20-year former legal counsel for the Disclosure Project, which I am, and the current legal counsel for Lou Elizondo, which I am. But I get on totally well with Stephen. We're totally cordial with each other. He and I were just together down in Mexico City with Jaime Maussan just last month. I respect, a significant amount of what it is that Stephen has said and the kind of important contributions that he's made to there's no doubt about that, in the entire field, the UFO field. And I'm completely supportive of his CE5 efforts to reach out and directly establish direct communication with the ETs. All of that stuff is extraordinarily valuable to the entire movement. I don't believe that there's been a decision made to engage in a false flag operation, and have a pretended UFO invasion. I don't think they've gone that far yet, though, as I pointed out to Stephen, that I'm perfectly aware of the fact that there are elements that are capable of that. Witness the Northwoods project, back with, under, U.S. Air Force General, whatever his name was, and so the bottom line is that I am completely cordial with Lou and with Stephen, with everybody. There's nobody that I have any kind of significant conflicts with. People who want to insist that I have conflicts with people with whom they have conflicts are classified, but that's just the way it is, because I genuinely see the kind of potential contribution that each of these people bring to a thing like this, and I do know that and I played some role in getting Lou Elizondo to be very candid with the members of Congress and to tell Congress that Lou is not telling them everything that he knows. That he knows a lot more than he's telling them, because he knows that he would be criminally prosecuted by the legacy group people, would cause the Justice Department to prosecute him as a violation of his national security agreement with them. Okay, and so what we've got is a situation where you have members of the employees of the executive branch sitting there directly in front of the United States Congress, telling them to pound sand. I'm not going to tell you because I'm part of the executive branch, and they've told me I don't have to talk to you. I mean, that's a profound and fundamental misreading of the Constitution of the United States. But it's clear that there are elements inside the executive branch that do so misread the Constitution. And that means that Lou, in fact, would be in jeopardy if he were to do that. So he's being candid, and he's actually gone to the point of telling Congress in open session that that's the state of things. And so he's put the issue to Congress. Are you willing to do anything about that? I've written the memos at the request of the House Oversight Committee people, explaining the constitutional authority that Congress has to completely ignore the position that the executive branch is taking of saying that you have to get security clearances from us in order for you to get access to the information, which, by the way, we're not going to give you.
Right.
So I say, excuse me, let's get a reading of the Constitution. Let's take a look at, Article 1, Section 8, paragraph 14, that it says the Congress of the United States has the authority to set the rules and regulations governing the United States military. And these are all military NDAs that they're imposing on these people. And so the Congress of the United States has the complete constitutional authority, and I've pointed it out at great length to the Congress now, in all the right places, providing it to them, saying, here are all the cases. Here's a half a dozen major United States Supreme Court cases that make it absolutely clear that the Congress of the United States has the initial authority to determine what is going to be classified, who's going to be given security clearances, who isn't, and what the criteria are going to be. And that the Congress of the United States, at any time it chooses to do so, can declassify any piece of information they want to. And they can insist that they be shown it in their oversight capacity. So they know that now. And still you're getting them saying, well, we've got to talk with the White House and get them to agree. We want them to, end up agreeing. And so all the White House has to do is say, no, we're not going to do it. And so Congress has got to, grow a full spine, here, and stand up to them, get up on their hind legs and stand up to them, and not only issue a directive to the executive branches that they have to gather all the information together and give it to them, as soon as possible, which turned out not to be possible at all.
Right.
They haven't given them direct, and the Congress knows it. And so that they're going to have to stand up and do this, right? So that's what we've got to get Congress to do. The ball is in the hands of Congress right now. Anybody who believes, Donald Trump when he says, "Oh, I'm going to sometime in the future give a directive to the Department of War and the other agencies to gather all this information together," they've already been ordered to gather all the information.
That was in the NDAA, right? Like that passed several years ago.
2003. That we got them to pass that. Even the House of Representatives went along with that. They just changed the language from saying, once you've got 300 days to gather it all together, and then you've got to turn it over immediately to the National Archives. That was the Senate version. The House version says, okay, you got the same 300 days. You're ordered to gather it all together. Then you got to turn it over as soon as possible. And then we got all this, my mother's horse died. I had a hangnail. The dog ate my homework. And the Congress is just now treading water in the face of that. And they've got to stand up and do something about this. And so what we're doing at the New Paradigm Institute is we're now circulating these pledge cards. Every single person who's running for a House seat in the United States Congress in all 435 congressional districts, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents or Green Party or Liberal, whatever party they're from, they are going to be required to sign a pledge card stating that if, in fact, they are elected, they will support full disclosure of the UFO stuff, just like they're going to demand the full disclosure of the Epstein documents, right? Okay, and if they don't, if they refuse to sign the pledge card, we're going to tell everybody, that these guys don't support disclosure of the UFO stuff, and so therefore you have to exercise your own judgment as to whether you want to vote for them.
And I guess it's fundamental, isn't it? If you don't support full disclosure, then you don't support transparency. You don't support holding power to account. You don't support the Constitution on a fundamental level.
Yeah, we don't need one more chicken shit, in the House of Representatives, so we don't need you. Now the point is that they need to have someone who's a competitor to them who will sign the card, to make it effective. So we have to do that. So we're going to tell people, those who have signed the card and those who don't sign the card, and then let the voters decide for themselves what they're going to do. But we've got to do something to start firming up the spine of the Congress right now. And you see them in a complete wimp kind of posture here. But now, it's becoming more and more obvious, even though we're, a whole, 8 months away from the election in November, basically, and things change very rapidly. But, there's a high probability that the House of Representatives is going to be taken over by the Democrats if things continue the way they're doing. And we're not taking one position or another. All we're saying is that as a public interest organization, we have to monitor what's going on in the Congress and who supports what political party supports what policies. We advocate policies. At the New Paradigm Institute, we advocate policy positions, and we can do that. And we can point out which candidates support our policies and which ones don't, and then let people make their decision for themselves. If they support our policies, then they have to make a decision. That's what we're doing.
I like that. So, you're treating them like adults.
Yeah, grow up. Get off the couch. Put the clicker down. Stop. Shifting around from as I say, talking to your television now. To shift from one of 500 different movies that you can sit and watch instead of being a citizen. Except once every 4 years, where people go in to vote and they get all excited, and still only about 51% of the people even vote. We're still falling behind with almost a full half of the people not voting. So we've got to get people engaged as citizens. And the advantage is that this UFO issue is an issue which almost everybody is really interested in. And some are really quite interested in this, the same way. But everybody's outraged now at the idea that the United States government has got possession of these craft and have recovered the bodies of these beings, and they know that they're non-human, and they're still not telling us about it. That they somehow think it's a national security secret that there's an entire non-human civilization surrounding us in our own galaxy. They're treating us like pygmies on a little island in Fiji in the 1950s that think they're the entire universe, and they didn't even realize there was a whole world outside there, and that's how they're trying to treat us, and that's insulting, and you don't want to have a representative who treats you like that, period.
Yeah. And it's not so outlandish now either to think that there's alien life out there. We've seen the Hubble pictures, the James Webb, everything like that. It's kind of like people shrug, yeah, I believe in aliens. There's probably life out there somewhere, right?
Yeah, but they're still attached to that old thing. I had the long conversation with Carl Sagan years ago when he was alive. He said, "Oh, I don't doubt that there's all kinds of intelligent life out in the universe. So they just can't get here." They can't get here because they'd have to travel faster than the speed of light, and they can't do that because I know physics and I know they can't do that. Well, it turns out that isn't true, obviously, because here they are.
Right. Right.
They figured that one out. And it turns out that it's stunningly not just linear, faster travel, but they leap from their star system directly to ours virtually instantaneously. And that's a whole other type of physics.
Right.
And it's a whole other, it's the physics that underlie bilocation.
And the world kind of in some ways becomes chaotic. If everyone can access that, then suddenly, you don't need to send a bomb on a parabolic arc through the air, right? A la Golden Dome. Suddenly you're just like materializing it where you need it to explode.
Yeah, and that's why it's dangerous to allow these people to have it. You've heard me probably say it. It's like the old Sufi saying, when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets. And so that these people are confronted with this absolutely extraordinary information about the existence of a sentient, highly intelligent, and highly technologically developed, but non-human set of species all around us in the galaxy. And all they can think about is trying to capture one of their crafts so they can make a hydrogen weapon delivery platform out of it. This is not good. This is not good advertising. As the lawyer who may someday end up having to represent our human family before the council for potential admission, this is a hard client to have to represent. Yeah. And so what we're saying is, look, let's get our client in shape to begin with before we have to meet this particular test. Okay, let's try to cure these habits, these bank robbing habits, these murdering and raping and pillaging habits that the client is into. So you can at least say that was in our past.
Yeah, so absolutely.
That's what we're working on now.
We got to hold ourselves accountable, right? And that begins, I guess, now with, acknowledging things like Immaculate Constellation, and calling out AARO for lying. Do you think AARO should be disbanded or replaced?
Well, what would you? I think it's a shibboleth. It's been intentionally created to be basically just a catch-all. That they want to have people that are wanting to blow the whistle on illegal activities inside the UFO community, and they come there, and AARO doesn't do anything about it except obviously report them. Oh, look, I've gotten a whistleblower to come forward. Hey, friends in the Defense Department, this guy's blowing the whistle on you. And people have stopped going there. People don't dare go there. They don't want to go there. They don't trust them. And getting rid of Sean, isn't going to change it, they get his deputy in there, and they've still got the same assignment, which is basically to pretend to be there to get information about it and do something about it. But there's no do something about it part of it. All they're doing is keeping the information and letting people know that they've got whistleblowers going on. So, whether you get rid of it or whether you don't, the fact of the matter is 99% of all the whistleblowers won't go there. So
there's no trust.
They've reached their trust with their constituents.
Well, what do you think they would need to do to become trusted? Like, are we talking a whole other organization outside the remit of the Department of Defense?
The Congress of the United States, pursuant to the law that we drafted for them, is the Congress of the United States has to reissue its demand that it did back in 2003, and they got to change the language to say that you've had your 300 days to do the gathering. If you don't do that, then we're going to hold you in contempt of Congress because you're under an order to gather that information together. And rather than have it be that you just need to turn it over as soon as possible, you have to turn it over immediately. Okay? And if you don't, you're in defiance of Congress. You're going to be held in contempt of Congress. We're going to subpoena you, drag you in here, and put you under oath and have you explain to us why you haven't done that. And it ain't going to be sufficient, whatever your argument is, and you're going to be held in contempt. And we're going to have the U.S. Marshals take you into custody and put you in jail. We have prisons for that, and that's what they're going to have to do. It's a throwdown against these criminals inside the executive branch. They're constitutional criminals, is what they are, and they've got to be dealt with as such, And then if they say, okay, mea culpa, okay, now I've agreed to give it to you. Just don't prosecute me. Don't put me in jail. Then we can have the discussion with them, Okay, if you're willing to relent and give us the stuff right now, we may, but something's got to be done. Because you just openly defied us.
Right.
The only reason you're doing it now isn't because you want to obey the Constitution. You just don't want to go to prison.
How do you trust someone that's broken your trust like that already, right?
That's right. So what I'm saying is because one of the advantages in having a legal group like the New Paradigm Institute with lawyers here is that we know what the Constitution, what the path is pursuant to which to get this all to happen. to do it within the confines of the legal system that we have. But if you get to the point where the legal system has done every single thing that it is authorized to do and it's not working, then changes have to be made. And that's what the Congress is there to do. They're constitutionally authorized to pass the laws that turn out to be necessary. And that's what they need to do. They need to pass this 58-page law. It's there right in front of them. They know exactly what it is. There's no gainsaying that it's correct. It's absolutely correct, and they know it. And rather than say, oh, I've got to go talk to the White House to get them to prepare a joint bill, with us in Congress, and perfectly well, the parts that the executive branch is going to insist upon is that the president ultimately decides what to make public and what not to do. You can't have that one. You can't have that one because that's just yielding the authority to the executive branch. Yeah. And you're giving away your constitutional authority that has been explicitly reposed in Congress, by the founders. You don't just turn around and give it away to the executive branch. That's violating your own constitutional obligations. So get out of there. We'll get somebody else in there in that seat.
Yeah,
that's what's going on right now.
You mentioned earlier about these kids that are being kind of swept up, these psychic kids, what we'll say. And I've read a lot about those kids. They're people who have autism, the neurodivergent kids, some of them. And I want to share with you what concerns me about that. I know this isn't coming from you. It's something you've heard. But I wonder if you can speak to it. So throughout history, autistic people have been repeatedly described as having special magical or otherworldly qualities, as seers, changelings, somehow apart from humanity. And that framing has a kind of long and painful history for autistic people. And what it's consistently done, I think, is rob them of the kind of the support they need. And that's what I want to be conscious of here, that as we're kind of speaking about this, we speak to that. It kind of gets twisted into some people get told they're starseeds or indigo child and things like that, and they just don't get that support. The parents get false hope. How do you ensure the dignity and well-being of autistic people while we're having these discussions at such a high level?
Well, actually, my whole experience with this is that people are marveling at them. They aren't trying to other them and say, oh, they're sort of non-human or they're in some sort of separate category that's derogatory. That they're in awe of these kids. The kid can sit there across the room and they say, okay, I'm reading a book here. And the person in the audience could just bring a book in at random and give it to the person. Okay, I'm holding a book here. What does it say? And the autistic child will sit there and start just telling you what's in it, as the other person, because they're getting it out of their brain. And it's perfectly clear, unless you got a setup where, you've lied to them and you've brought in a book that they've already read ahead of time and they know what page you're going to open it to and all that. That isn't what's going on here. That there are all kinds of people that are in the audience that are taking steps to demonstrate that this is actually truly happening. Okay. And so the people are in awe of these kids, and it's really quite the contrary. The response people are having, they're having an entirely new level of respect for these kids. Even though some of them can't talk, some of them, can't really control their bodily muscles and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is they can do this other thing. And they communicate with each other, and some of them are extraordinarily intelligent. They're savants in these special areas. So the key will be to kind of help organize these kids to be able to display those kind of savant talents that they've got, and facilitate them, translating that into a career, so that this is their role in life, that they get to do this stuff. And that they're highly respected and they're seen as being thoroughly competent in those areas. In the other areas where they're not very developed, look at Stephen Hawking. I mean, Stephen Hawking, was in this absolutely almost helpless physical condition, and yet he was one of the great minds. of our time, and people were able to accommodate him and bring him to conferences and stuff like that. They developed a way to enable him to talk, through the little machine. There's all kinds of ways that we can do this, and that this actually holds out hope for an entire new level of respect for people that are autistic.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like what you're saying is that previously people have been taken against their will to do this stuff, shoved in
That's
a spaceship, told to fly it, whereas now it's kind of becoming a genuine partnership with the community. Would that be correct?
Well, what we're trying to do is to keep them from servicing the military. We don't want the autistic kids that we encounter, to be recruited by the military and try to turn them into some sort of special intelligence agents. Here, read the mail of the Russian embassy, kind of stuff. That we're going to do everything we can do to keep that from happening. But we know that's right where they went. In the Stargate process, with Pat Price and stuff, they were having them be spies, against Russia and China. And those were folks that weren't autistic. They were just especially gifted. It was clear that Pat Price was a savant, as was Ingo and some of the other folks. But the bottom line is we need to have these people. We need to come to grips with the fact that this is real, take it out of the shadows of secrecy, realize that it's real talent, and have that talent directed to positive services to the human family. Not to the military. It's just basically what Pope Leo is saying. Pope Leo is saying, God doesn't answer the prayers of those who make war on others. And so we've got to get them to understand that those who are engaged in making war on the world and trying to impose their military dominance over the world in exchange for their continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed by their major corporations are not entitled to constitutional respect. That is a fundamental violation of the premises of our country. Our country was not created to be a dominant military power. And the reality is, when you study the recent history, the major adversaries of the United States, China and Russia both, they were responding to aggressive activity that was being undertaken against them, by the United States. What's his head? The guy who was the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He launched a military invasion of Russia to try to oust the Bolshevik popular government that came into power in 1917. I mean, they started a war right with them, trying to attack them and destroy them because they viewed them as an enemy of transnational capitalism. And they viewed themselves as the offense. They were the Tom Brady. He's not a defensive back. He's trying to run into your territory and take your touchdown area. That's what they're doing. So we've got to come to grips with that. It's a profound and fundamental realization that we have to come to. And it's one of the main things that I've learned in the whole 50 years that I've spent in legal practice is I know that the national security state people in our United States government are in fact a criminal element. They're a criminal element and they're serving the interests of major stockholders of major corporations. And many of them are being rewarded when they retire from government, being hired into these major corporations. These aerospace corporations are constantly hiring the generals who have been steering contracts their way. That this is criminal. And that's subject to the Federal Criminal Racketeering Act. This is a RICO operation that we see going on here. And we're going to point that out to people.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Do you think that you kind of touched on it already, but the mechanisms that we're talking about here, the institutions that we're talking about, they were built to serve a materialist world and where, we're getting to consciousness and stuff like that. Do you think that those mechanisms can serve something that's more spiritual, more consciousness based, or have we got to just tear it all down and build it all up again?
No. I think I'm hoping that our New Paradigm Institute is going to be successful in proposing a set of amendments that we can take some of the institutions that we have, the educational institutions and others, and we can evolve them into serving these higher conscious motives. We can do that. Some of them you can't. The kind of banking system that we have now with the fractal banking and the currency form that that they predicate on something other than any attachment to any kind of natural resource is ridiculous. It's absurd, in a substantial portion of the wealth that is shared by people like this Jeff Epstein and his crowd, is all fabricated and manufactured, by having banks be able to lend as much as 10 times more money than they actually have on deposit there, and they're just fabricating money. And then they end up being in control of all of that fake money. And then they exchange those shekels for yachts in country homes,
While the rest of us are struggling to rub 2 pennies together and pay for gas,
Exactly. So we've got to take some radical action to set up, for example, a demand side economy instead of having a supply side economy that's driven by the manufacturers and the producers of products, and that we cater to them and give them massive loans and subsidies and all of that, and let them become rich as allegedly an ancillary benefit of our system. In fact, this whole purpose, but have it be a demand side economy of what it is that people need. And not have them get all this fake, sales stuff, getting them to believe that they've got to talk to their television to change the channels, or sit there and have some electric manicure for their toes. That this is, this supply side driven economy. And, Bernie Sanders and AOC and a number of the other people are talking about this. It isn't as though that people don't know what the alternative economic system can be. And that's not a socialist system. That is just a system predicated upon the needs of people, and that's in the subsidies that can be provided by the collective government to help stimulate the production of materials that are needed by people and actually demanded by people. That this system can be worked out, and we're doing that at the New Paradigm Institute.
I have a question from my wife, Alaina. She always looks at the legal side of things. She's been drenched in the Atomic Energy Act, and she has a question for you. So, sure. She says the Atomic Energy Act automatically classifies anything nuclear. No official decision is required. It's just born classified from the moment it exists. After leaving AARO, Tim Phillips confirmed dozens of genuinely inexplicable UAP that were not nuclear programs. So the government is using nuclear secrecy law to hide things its own officials have confirmed aren't nuclear. Why hasn't that challenge been filed? And what would it actually take to mount a First Amendment challenge to born classified doctrine on those grounds?
It's not. It wouldn't be a First Amendment grounds. It's a statutory violation. It's violating the legislative intent of the Atomic Energy Act. It's a statutory challenge. It could be brought to the judicial branch. The problem is that the court system, under the aegis of the national security state, since 1947, has developed this entire doctrine of national security information. It's basically a political question, or they call it, or a non-justiciable issue. That they've just set up this entire category of we ain't going to go there. No matter how clear it is, the evidence of the fact that this is fraud, we're just not going to do it. So we've got to get past that. We've got to get the court system to do away with this secrecy category of things. And they can't do that. But there needs to be a statutory challenge mounted, saying that this is a violation of the statutory intent. Now that we have a whole set of doctrines now about executive branches exceeding what the original intent of Congress was of a particular statute. Okay, so that they have to mount some litigation. What we have to do is let things cool down a little bit here for another couple of years, to get the Judiciary Committee in place in both the House and the Senate, ideally, that will come to grips with this. Except the problem is the Democratic Party is equally wedded to this whole capitalist economic system. And so that, whether we're going to have to mount some sort of a new Democratic Party or a new Republican Party, in light, the old Republican Party is in shambles right now. You have this entire MAGA takeover of the Republican Party, that somebody has to rejuvenate a Republican Party or some other new party, to play the role of the traditional Republican Party, and there has to be an entire progressive party generated to support the policies that the kind of progressives in the Democratic, the Progressive Caucus in the Congress is the largest caucus of the entire Congress. There's over 100 of the 435 members of the House. Over 100 of them are all members of the Progressive Caucus. But they've got to vote as a block. They've got to coordinate their activities. They've got to set forth a set of policies, in a sense, a progressive government in waiting, to actually elucidate a full set of programs. In fact, now that you bring, we've drafted it. we've got an entire for all 15 cabinet level positions in all 8 of the major agencies. We have an entire panoply of principles, policies, and specific programs that will implement a genuinely progressive government. And that's what we need to do, and do this in a response to the full demonstration of what a reactionary and authoritarian government looks like. That Donald Trump has provided the service, if you will, of demonstrating to everybody what this thing looks like. And even some of his most ardent followers are going, uh-oh,
Right.
This is just exactly what people were warning us about. This is not just a person who is in fact a malignant narcissist from a clinical point of view, but he's an out and out authoritarian fascist, and that they've got to come to grips with that. That isn't what they really intended. They were just kind of PO'd, at the fecklessness of the Democratic Party, that has begun right at the end of the Cold War in 1992. That the regular Democratic Party said, well, wait a second, the Soviet Union is basically now withdrawn from the field challenging the capitalist system across the world. And so why should we continue to promote and promulgate the kind of semi-socialist programs, of the Franklin Roosevelt era that were promulgated by the Democratic Party simply as an ameliorative, so that they wouldn't lose everybody to kind of joining socialist parties, So that that what we've got to do is we've got to formulate, as we've done, a set of progressive policies, explain what the principles are, explain what the policies themselves are, what the different concrete programs are, and make these available, so that when in fact the response sets in to kind of recoiling against this kind of authoritarian government that he's trying to put in place, and that they've spent all of their goodwill, these reactionaries and authoritarians, so that there's a genuinely progressive, liberal to progressive government, that can cooperate with the other liberal governments of the world, and help lead the way into a progressive future, and establish alliances with Russia, reach out to China. I mean, North Korea is kind of a sui generis, it's kind of a crazy, weird place, and steps need to be taken to do something to keep them from deploying any nuclear weapons against people. It has to be done on a collective basis, in a way that doesn't injure the people of North Korea. I mean, they're victims enough. So there are lots of things that we need to do, and that's what the New Paradigm Institute is doing. And we're doing it in connection with the revelations of the information that is known about the UFOs, because it, in fact, expands the consciousness of everybody to realize that reality is a much larger circle that encompasses all of the other concentric circles of smaller, more narrow perspective realities. And so that we have to have our systems, economic, cultural, political, religious, and spiritual, be resonant with a much higher and more expanded dimension of reality. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah. You spoke to something really important there too, about going in with hope and recognizing it when it turns into something else. And, I look at this administration and I recognize the same thing. People were hopeful that there would be,
Yes.
I guess, drain the swamp, right? But clearly it was used to further the swamp. And I see companies like, people like Peter Thiel, Palantir kind of getting their grubby mitts into these contracts and, persisting once the administration is gone. So I guess I want to ask you, from your point of view, what are the danger signs that disclosure is being used as a vehicle for something other than transparency? And what should listeners be tracking? What should people be watching for?
Well, what people should be watching for is a fake disclosure program. Pointing out just limited information that basically the public generally has a pretty good idea is true already. It's a fake disclosure. It's partly what Stephen Greer has been jumping up and down and saying, this is a psyops. He's saying this is a psychological operation, trying to pretend that they're going to reveal the stuff, and they're not going to reveal the stuff really. They're going to conceal all the basic stuff. Get under national security, weapons policy, all that kind of stuff, But the bottom line is that as I say, Lou and Chris Mellon and Grush and others have always been very clear about the fact that they're not revealing everything that they know. that they view themselves as being under personal threat, from the national security state, the legacy program, of not just, denying them future security clearances, or retaliating against them and ruining their reputation, but possibly actually undertaking violent action against them. That's true. But when you're told that is the condition that we're in, somebody ought to do something about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a guy in the back room with a gun trained on me right now, officer. I think somebody ought to do something about it. The police officer is supposed to say, gee, I hope somebody does something for you.
Yes.
But that's what Congress is doing right now. It's the role of Congress. Gee, somebody ought to do something about this. Well, that's your job. That's what you're being paid for. And if you can't do the job, step out of there and we'll get somebody that can.
You've been so great to us, Danny. Thank you so much for just enlightening us all. There's so much in this apparatus that is just by design impenetrable to people like me, right? And it's people like you that kind of bridge that gap. But what I want to know, so you've spent so long doing this, you've spoken to so many different people from a really different perspective of, experiences, or people like me just kind of sat at home, trying to pass all this. So this is a very human approach, I think. You're trying to help everyone else. You've been speaking about that throughout this whole interview. So what do you think, in light of everything you've been through, everything you learned, what do you think it means to be human?
I think that the human species, Homo sapien, at the stage that we've reached, of having ascended from Australopithecus through Homo erectus to Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, to where we are now as Homo sapien, that we're on the brink of the next step of biological evolution, and that we're going to be able to develop an additional faculty that we have that is latent still in us, that was displayed by Christ, was displayed by Lao Tzu, by the Buddha, to others that display these kind of charisms or these talents that they have of, being able to levitate, to be able to transmute matter from one form into another, to be able to lay hands on people and to establish their energy field back into resonance so that they come back to life or healthy. This is what's really going on, and that our human person is a technology which is able to attune our consciousness to differing vibrational frequencies that's going to give us access to other dimensions of reality. And that one of these dimensions is the reality of the extraterrestrial civilization that's all around us, and that we're going to be able to move to our next stage of evolution. I don't know to what degree it's going to change our physical appearance. It has done so from Australopithecus to Homo erectus, et cetera, that we've undergone these different changes in physiology. But this is Teilhard de Chardin writes about it, that this is the omega point that Christ and the other prophets have been talking about, the Parousia, that where we'll get to a point where we will evolve into this next state of consciousness, and we're going to have the kind of internal psychic-driven technologies of being able to access these other vibrational frequencies. And it's going to be like seeing anew, actually having direct access to these other dimensions of reality. And a part of this reality is star travel, in that we're going to be able to travel to other star systems. We're going to be able to explore our galaxy. And all of this is going to happen, within the next 100 years, and so that we're sort of at part of the cutting edge of this thing. And it's got all kinds of mysterium et tremendum, as they call it, kind of bizarre things going on and strange capacities that people are displaying. The troglodytes, holding fast to the old world, and threatening you. Oh yeah, I'm going to beat you in the head with a club. If you try to do something that's kind of more evolved than we are, And so we say, well, we just have to prevent them from beating us up with clubs. And be smart enough to avoid that. But to try, don't waste all of our time trying to convert them. Not relying on the national security state people to voluntarily give us this information, because they keep telling you over and over again, they're not going to do it. And they sure would like us to spend all of our time beating on their front door that they've gotten completely barricaded against us, and waste our time, that we've got to go around and go in the kitchen window. That we've got to transcend this desire to get trapped in a dialectic against them. And what we've got to do is we've got to gather together and sit with our friends and neighbors out in the field at night and reach out telepathically to establish direct communion with these extraterrestrials. I mean, we've got to come to grips with what it is that we are virtually certain is the truth now, and act accordingly. Not keep saying, well, yeah, I believe that that's true, but I'm not going to do that. You're not going to catch me sitting out in any kind of field going, woo, 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 and trying to talk to the UFOs. I can encourage other people to do that, but I'm not going to do that. We've got to step across. You got to step into your power and step up and do this. And that, the meek shall inherit the earth, dare I say.
You can find Danny's work at newparadigminstitute.org and danielpsheehan.com. His memoir, The People's Advocate, is available now. Danny's also talking at Contact in the Desert at the end of May, and you can get tickets for that at contactinthedesert.com. If this conversation did what I hoped it did, you're not just thinking about UFOs differently, you're thinking about power differently and what gets hidden and why and who pays the price for not knowing. That's been Danny Sheehan's life's work, and it deserves your attention. Thank you for listening, and Danny, thank you so much for joining us.
Terrific, Dan. I appreciate that. It's a privilege, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Spotify or on your chosen platform. If you could like, share, or subscribe, that would be very much appreciated. It helps us find our tribe. If you'd like to support the show and get access to a 1-hour live chat each month and early ad-free access, you can find us at Patreon. Just follow the link in the show notes or at our website, tobehumanshow.com. And feel free to reach out via the contact page or email at hello@tobehumanshow.com. As always, remember to be curious. The universe is bigger than we know.
What It Means to Be Human is a double-barrel production. This week's episode was produced by Roz Mugford and Dan Zetterstrom. Sound post-production by Parker Mosley with technical support from Dale Mugford. Our theme music is by Thunderbird.